I just want to take another moment to introduce another project that I'm working on. And so within the next few months here, hopefully we'll have a gamut of performance book. This book is going to be geared at how interns can kind of find a mentor and some of the need to know things that they should dive into before they even start their journey on interning. This is a must-have book for anyone that's really trying to get into the field. So keep an eye out for that, and it's going to be out here in the next couple months. Welcome to the Gamut of Performance Podcast, episode 52. On this episode of the podcast, we have Dr. Matt Jordan. Dr. Jordan talks a little bit about the science and approach of what he does. There's a lot of good concepts in this one, so without further ado, here is Dr. Matt Jordan. Dr. Matt Jordan, thank you so much for your time. Really looking forward to chatting with you a little bit and kind of learning a little bit more about what you do. So for the listeners at home, will you tell us a little bit about your background, your motivation, and kind of where you are currently?
Yeah, absolutely. So I originally came from Ottawa, Ontario, which is the capital of Canada.
Okay.
I was an athlete, and I moved to the Olympic Training Center for, kind of to pursue a career as an athlete, but ended up getting really interested in kinesiology. Moved out here. I met a person that many of your listeners will probably know, a guy named Charles Poliquin, who at the time was the strength coach here at the Olympic Training Center in Calgary.
Okay.
And I never thought in a million years as a high school student that, you could have a career as a strength coach. And, basically when I met him, I that was it. I was kind of on this trajectory to, getting my kinesiology degree and wanting to become a strength coach.
Yeah.
And so, from there, I started off pretty humble, as most of us do in the profession. I was working odd jobs like hospital security guard on Friday and Saturday evenings. And I'd get done my 6 a.m. shift after a full night shift of wrestling drunk guys and whatever else, and going to the gym and coaching athletes. And from there, started to work with some of our Olympic programs and got my master's, and spent the next bit of time as a strength and conditioning coach with Olympic bound athletes. And that dovetailed into, research interests, especially around knee injuries, PhD. And now I'm, basically strength coach / performance scientist / consultant and researcher. So.
Awesome. Okay. Well, you kind of touch on a little bit of the nuances of some of those Olympic bound athletes and what their training might look like?
Our Olympic Training Center deals primarily with winter sport athletes.
Okay.
To put them into three bins. We've got our endurance athletes, sports like cross-country skiing and speed skating. We use strength training primarily to build injury resilience and also to improve performance. We've got our strength, power, speed athletes like bobsledders, for example, that are needing to be extremely strong and fast. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we've got our technical sports like alpine skiing, freestyle skiing, snowboarding.
Okay.
These athletes are oftentimes not really familiar sports for strength and conditioning coaches, but strength demands are actually very, very high.
Yeah.
These athletes are literally pushing their bodies to the brink, and they need to be at that limit in order to perform at the highest level.
Okay.
So we're needing to prepare them physically very well to be able to handle the demands of a high-risk sport.
Okay. And so coming from a background, let's say you came into this, right, and you didn't necessarily have a background in some of these winter sports. So how did you kind of make up the time or make up the knowledge into getting well-versed in working with these sports?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. And I think it's one that maybe really sort of shapes a couple of different paradigms or philosophies in strength and conditioning, which is like, do you need to have done the sport in order to have the ability to help athletes be good at the sport? And my perspective has always been that if you have good principles of strength and conditioning and human physiology and biomechanics, and you can appreciate human movement, you can learn the nuances of sports to be able to help affect change with athletes. So I guess the first starting point would be, using my knowledge of physiology and biomechanics to understand the factors that would influence how an athlete in that sport would be able to, generate muscle force and how they may need to perform. But I think to be really specific, because I always spend quite a bit of time with my athletes looking at video and having them walk me through alongside their coaches to understand the true demands and the true technical gaps and challenges that they have. I think that's often overlooked by strength and conditioning professionals, is that kind of top-down viewpoint about how we almost reverse engineer performance. It's a phrase a friend of mine, Scott Livingston, uses a lot.
Okay.
But essentially what it boils down to is, sitting with the coach and the athlete and really understanding, what they're trying to do in their sport, how they're arriving at performance, so that we can come at it not only from the reverse engineer standpoint, where you're starting with the sport and working down, but then also being able to work up from the physiological and biomechanical demands that all ultimately obviously would be influenced by training.
Yeah, okay. Would you have any advice for, say, someone who's working in the college realm that's trying to break into some of these Olympic sports, or even some other sport that may not be necessarily most popular?
Yeah, I think it always helps when you have a diverse coaching background. And I know when I started off as a strength and conditioning coach, I literally tried to coach anybody and everyone. And my initial years as a strength and conditioning coach, I was working with football players, hockey players, figure skaters, speed skaters, soccer players.
Wow.
Helping rehab athletes. Like I really tried to get a as diverse a group of athletes as I could to be able to help develop skills. And I think when you're at that stage where you're wanting to diversify and get into new sports and new and in new environments, I think the key is to really start by understanding what the sport's about and understanding the culture of the sport. And I think that last word there, culture, is the key, right? It's a lot of times where we struggle is when you come in from a background that might have a very strong culture, and I'm thinking here like college football, where the strength and conditioning culture is really, really firmly established. And then you come into some of these trick-based sports, like let's say snowboarding, where the lifestyle is like, these are the guys that are living on the edge. They need excitement in their life. The last place they want to be in is in a gym doing power cleans. Yeah. And so, we have to understand the culture of the sport very, very well, and understand where we fit, where we can fit inside that culture to help improve performance. So, my big thing to coaches who are starting out in new sports, or who are wanting to get into new sports, is get a real feel for that culture and understand the nuances of how, what drives those athletes and makes them tick, so that you can communicate to them on their level, and obviously get the buy-in, which is most important to be able to get the changes that we want.
Okay. And then will you kind of talk a little bit about your specific educational path?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my path basically, when I got out to Calgary and got enrolled in kinesiology, initially it was to do a minor in philosophy alongside kinesiology, because I just was very passionate about philosophy and religion, and just sort of understanding those areas of study, and it was just more personal interest than anything else. But as I was going through my degree and realizing that my path was to become a strength and conditioning coach, I realized that was the next step. I had to move towards a science-based way of thinking. And my master's I did in exercise physiology and muscle physiology. The main focus of my thesis was looking at the effects of whole body vibration on muscle function. And I had a couple of excellent supervisors in my master's that really helped shape my viewpoint on where science integrates with coaching. And then moving on, after I actually spent quite some time after my master's just being, coaching and being a practitioner of the craft. And I think that was a really good time for me, because it helped me to hone my, coaching interests, and also to really develop some important, relevant research questions is probably a better word. And that helped me kind of tee up a master or a PhD, which I did in medical science. So, again, kind of seeing that, especially at the highest level in our profession, very often we're sort of bridging the gap between, physiology, biomechanics to medicine. And I decided to pursue a PhD in medical science because I felt at the time, and I still do, that it helped round out my knowledge base around human performance. And so, did a PhD there, and that was the journey.
Okay. So with that decision to get a PhD, do you think it was a very important or necessary decision to get to where you are now, or do you think it was just kind of a little bit of differentiator and you kind of just used it positively?
I think where I started out with the PhD was with a lot of questions from people about why do you want to do this? And because just for your listeners out there who might be sitting there contemplating this and wondering, oh shoot, I'm too old or I've got too much on the go. I actually went back quite a bit later in life to get the PhD done. And it was, I was in my 30s. So I was, it was a little bit of a daunting task to be back in a traditional classroom with, people who were 10 years younger than me, who were far more intelligent than I was. And I had to dust off the cobwebs from, 10 years ago to be able to take exams and do all the things that a lot of times that, I guess cause us a lot of stress even when we're young, never mind when we're a bit older and we've got a family and a full-time job. Yeah. So that was definitely a lot to chew off, but as I was contemplating this, I would get those questions frequently from people about like, why do you want to do this? Almost as though like some people would be in one of three camps. There'd be people who would almost make it seem like, what do you need a PhD for? It's it doesn't add any knowledge. It's just, jumping through hoops. Yeah. And there would be other people who would actually sincerely be asking the question because they would be questioning whether or not my intentions were in the right place to do it by the virtue of, just going to do it to get the letters after your name is not the reason to do it. Yeah. And then, you have possibly a third group of people who, would look at the work or the effort involved and I guess question whether or not, as a strength and conditioning coach, whether that was really a necessary component of it. And so I had a bit of doubts maybe, but I think, my sort of reflections on the process now that I've done it is that it actually was a hugely transformative experience for me, even though it was really tough. I kind of joke in my last year of my PhD, my appendix ruptured, believe it or not. Oh, wow. Okay. And the reason that it went undiagnosed, and I'm convinced of this, for the 3 days as I was leading into the hospital was that I'd be sitting in the emergency room and the docs would be coming in to check in on me. And I'd be sitting there working on my review of the literature that was actually a publication that we'd gotten asked to write. Yeah. So here I am sitting here with an appendix that's about ready to pop, and I'm, madly working away on my computer trying to get shit done. And ultimately I say like the appendix rupture and the 4 weeks of downtime that I had after was perfect because that's where I actually wrote my thesis and finished it off. And when you think about that, you're like, well, it's a lot to go through for getting a PhD. It was, it was a huge physical and mental push on my body. But what I would say in hindsight it was probably one of the more transformative experiences in my life because it took me way out of my comfort zone. And I think that that's a key in life is obviously you got to be willing to push yourself outside of your comfort zone in order to be challenging yourself. And it's when you feel uncomfortable and it's when you feel like everything is going to, everything is stacked against you. Yeah. That's when the real growth in life happens. And I would just say that 4-year process was a hugely transformative experience. And I picked some really good mentors in my PhD supervisory committee. And I would say that their experience and knowledge and who they were as people rubbed off on me as much as the mentorship I got on in terms of the academic and scientific mentorship. And so I really came out of it a better person, and I definitely came out of it a better communicator. I think that overall, pushing yourself in that direction and trying to really challenge your way of thinking and to challenge yourself to generate new knowledge, which is basically what a PhD should be about, is contributing to the body of knowledge. When you push yourself there and you expose your ideas and your thoughts, I think that it can only bring great opportunity and great growth. And I reflect on it as a very positive, but an extremely challenging period of my life.
That's awesome. And so at that time, while you were doing your PhD, were you also coaching at the same time?
Oh yeah, I was. Man, I had two boys. And so just to give a little bit of a personal background, I'd always thought of that I would do a PhD. And when I was first moved to Calgary, within a couple of years, I met my girlfriend at the time, and she was kind of destined to become a doctor, a physician. Okay. So as she was pursuing medical school, we ended up getting engaged and got married. And as she pursued medical school and residency, my viewpoint was, well, you know what, I'll I'll put on hold my dreams and aspirations of a PhD.
Yeah.
I'll support her through her residency and through the medical school piece. And then when she's done and making the big bucks, quote unquote, right, I can just go back and do what I want at that time.
Yeah.
But as life progressed, we had a son together, and then within about a year and a half of him being born, we split up, and that was a very, very tough period because our split up came with a big personal cost.
Yeah.
Namely that you have instability in your life, and now it's no longer a partnership. It's like I've got to figure out how to provide for. I have to figure out how to provide for my son, and that took precedent over everything. And so I had a small window of opportunity. I met, I actually, very luckily met my wife that I'm now married to, and we have 2 kids together. I met her at my best friend's wedding, and we literally hit it off. And I'm telling you, I had a window of opportunity where her and I had just got married. We had no kids between us yet. So I just had my son from my previous relationship, and I was coaching full time, and literally I had to find a way to fit the PhD with all those 3 things, like my work, my life, and obviously my interests. And so it was a lot. Like, it was balancing, clearly multiple things. But I think one of the pieces of advice I would give to any of the listeners out there who want to pursue something like this is you got to find these synergies in life where I worked really hard to marry my research interests and my PhD up with my professional interests at work, so that I would be successful in actually accomplishing it. And if it wasn't for the fact that those 2 things were very closely linked, there's no way I would have been able to do it. To long answer to your question is yes, I was working full time. I had a wife, a new marriage, and I had a son from a previous relationship. And within, I think in our last year and a half of my PhD, my wife and I had our firstborn, Nash. And so with the final year and a half of my PhD, we had this newborn on the horizon too, to fully round out the chaos that was my life. Yeah.
Wow, that's quite a story right there, right? So, with all that, so what kind of, you touched a little bit on the technology and some of the athlete monitoring, right? But what kind of athlete monitoring are you kind of looking at, and what kind of factors, and what is your approach to monitoring with different groups?
Well, from a research standpoint, my main research paradigm is looking at neuromuscular adaptations to resistance training.
Okay.
And looking at that either from a performance standpoint or from an injury standpoint. And the ACL injury space is really the big research interest that I have, and it's where I did a lot of my PhD work, and it's where I continue to publish and present and obviously consult with either organizations or sport medicine clinics who are wanting to improve and advance their knowledge base in getting athletes back after ACL injury. And so in that paradigm of ACL injury, and particularly around return to sport, the research interests we have are developing new diagnostic tests and tools. And one thing that I developed through my PhD was the use of dual force plates, and looking at vertical jump asymmetries and performance with dual force plate systems. We're looking to correlate the types of injuries that athletes get to the knee joint, so they get their ACL, let's say they tear the ACL, but they also tear their MCL and tear their meniscus and have some sort of bone injury. We want to correlate the pattern of injury and establish relationships with functional recovery. So we need to have obviously testing and monitoring tools to monitor athletes as they get back after injury. And then lastly, once we know what those normative patterns look like, we want to develop better rehabilitation techniques to help improve those timelines. And so that's the research paradigm that we're in. And obviously the research paradigm that I am currently very passionate about is influencing my work as a practitioner. And I would say that I'm trying to capture, in essence,
Yeah.
three things in my monitoring paradigm. The first thing is what's the input,
Okay.
and the input is two things. It's what I've planned,
Yeah.
and it's what's incurred by the athlete.
Mm-hmm.
So having that anchor is absolutely essential, because if we don't know what we prescribed, and we don't know what was incurred by the athlete,
Mm-hmm.
everything is for naught. Because I often say when I'm teaching at the university to my undergraduate students, our medicine, quote unquote, is exercise. Like that's basically the value proposition, is that I use my knowledge base about exercise. I prescribe very specifically intensities and volumes and densities of exercise with particular exercise types.
Uh-huh.
And the goal is that if I do that in the right way, that I will achieve a better performance at some point in the time in the future.
Yeah.
And often that's a known point in time, whether it's an Olympic Games or a World Championships.
Mm-hmm.
So having that prescription documented, quote unquote, and knowing what we did is so essential to the process. So number one is I've got to have a measure of what I did, what I planned, and obviously what was incurred by the athlete.
Yeah.
And around that, I still come back to probably one of the most effective measures is looking at the internal training load. And we can quantify that very easily by looking at the intensity perceived by the athlete on a scale from 1 to 10 as a modified Borg scale, and the duration of that session, and that gives us a training load measure in arbitrary units that we can use to get an anchor for what that incurred load is on the athlete.
Okay.
The second thing that is in my paradigm, and I think it's really key, is what's my athlete's adaptive potential at any given point in time. And adaptive potential just means that at any given point in time, whether you've had a fight with your girlfriend, or you stubbed your toe in the morning, or you've got a lingering injury that's been bugging you and is starting to flare up, your adaptive potential may be compromised.
Yeah.
And that's where our dual force plate asymmetry testing comes in, because what we're looking at is the capacity of the athlete to absorb external energy as they either reverse their downward acceleration in a jump or land from a jump.
Yeah.
And we're looking at their propulsive forces. And we look at these asymmetries in these standardized and repeatable movements like counter movement jumping or drop jumping or squat jumping.
Okay.
And we're able to get an insight into changes in the functional asymmetries of the athlete that can provide us a reflection on their adaptive potential at any point in time.
Okay.
In addition to that, we're lucky here at our Olympic Training Center because regarding adaptive potential of the athlete, we have a full biochem lab here and a phlebotomist that can take blood draws. We also have I use heart rate variability quite a bit.
Okay.
In my assessments of adaptive potential.
Yeah.
And then the last component is how my athlete reacts to training from a performance standpoint. And my good friend Derek Evely, who spent a good part of his life working with Anatoly Bondarchuk.
Oh, wow.
They've got a paradigm, and they often call the phrase reaction curves, or the reaction of the athlete to the training stimulus.
Yeah.
But that's a big part of the final component of my monitoring paradigm, which is I need to have some way to evaluate how the athlete has reacted to training from a performance standpoint.
Wow.
And so if we bin all those together, we've got what was prescribed, what was incurred, the adaptive potential of my athlete, and finally how they react to training from a performance standpoint. Put all those three together, and to me, you've got a pretty comprehensive monitoring program.
Interesting. Okay. So on that, you talked about ACLs, right? So kind of two questions within that research is, have you seen a lot of articles on overtraining and risk of ACL injury?
I don't know that there's a lot of articles on it. I think actually, if you look at the literature, let's just say that overtraining is a very, very, if we use the term classically, overtraining is a syndrome which is characterized by prolonged and stubborn loss of performance, and also many other associated physiological and neural changes. But if we maybe scale back a little bit, I guess the question might be, it's like, and I might get roasted from this from my good friends who are fatigue scientists and whatnot, but let's just call overtraining a very, very extreme form of unrecoverable fatigue from training and a bad training prescription. Yeah. If we kind of take a step back and we talk about this idea of performance fatigability, or basically the effects of fatigue on performance, the negative effects where either force producing capability or power producing capability are diminished consequent to fatigue processes. Yeah. The literature right now is actually pretty equivocal on whether or not there's an association with performance fatigability and ACL injuries. In
Yeah.
fact, I think the best evidence at the current state and time is that we don't have a lot of evidence for an association between the two, other than observations in some sports that injuries may happen more towards the end of a game or the end of a race, presumably when fatigue factors are present.
Yeah. Okay.
What we do know is that performance fatigability does affect biomechanics, and it does change the coordinative patterns of how muscles are activated. And if we take all those things together, we might be able to provide some sort of, I guess, rationale for why understanding the effects of performance fatigability on the motor control, neuromuscular strategies, and biomechanics of athletes becomes important. So it's absolutely a part of our test battery. We do an acute performance fatigability test where our athletes perform an 80-second repeated squat jump test, and we look at changes in muscle activity, changes in how they absorb energy and generate propulsive forces, left versus right. And I would say that while maybe the really strong, clear association between the two is not quite there, I would say just from a standpoint of pragmatically as a strength coach, I think it is an important consideration. But there isn't a lot of studies on that. I think that needs to be stated.
Okay. And so on that same kind of token, right, you talked a bit about return to play protocols. Have you seen any research in the literature, or have you seen anything yourself as far as with concussions and risk of ACL, increased risk of ACL injury?
Yeah, well, there definitely are some studies that have emerged where the associations have been made where post-concussion athletes are at higher risk for lower limb injuries. It's actually another big area of research for our training center here. I work at the training center is called the Canadian Sport Institute Calgary, which again, as I said earlier in the call, is one of four Olympic training centers in Canada. And one of our big research priorities alongside the ACL return to sport piece is actually looking at concussion return to sport. And so we know now, based on published science, that the athletes are at elevated risk for lower limb injuries after a concussion. So I think it's an important consideration, especially when we think about the fact that, we're not dealing with X's and O's, we're dealing with a whole organism that self-organizes and that has incorporation of fears and anxieties and stresses, and all of these things combined are obviously working together in some sort of synergy. And the more we can be sort of like taking a whole systems approach to looking at our athletes, I think the better we'll be as practitioners. And clearly knowing, concussion history and its potential risk for future lower limb injuries is something that needs to be on everyone's radar.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay. And then kind of moving forward a little bit, right? Will you talk a little bit about kind of your website, Jordan Strength, kind of online training and some of your online internship program kind of topics, I guess?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. I mean, I love teaching and I love mentorship. It's a big passion of mine. And I've, been really lucky here at our university and also through our Olympic Training Center to be able to have lots of opportunities to mentorship. Many practitioners who've come up through our pipeline and then on to doing great work in numerous professional teams and obviously within the Canadian sports system. But my next step in that was always trying to provide an opportunity for coaches out there who really want to become coach scientists. And I think it's a polarized thing a lot of times in conversations. Like a lot of times you hear you're either a coach or you're a scientist, and coaches lament the scientists for, criticizing their, more artistic and let's just say free approaches to coaching. And then, and vice versa. We have the opposite side, which is that maybe coaches aren't scientific enough and sort of spewing the magic potion, secret sauce type approach to training. And I've never really felt a polarization personally. I've always felt that you need both. Like you need to hone your instincts. You need to hone your judgments. You need to hone your experience, and you need to be kind of constantly curious and observing just at face value what is happening with your athletes, in a very inquisitive way. And then I think ultimately you need to understand how to bring the science behind the coaching to help generate new knowledge. And bringing science behind the coaching doesn't mean that you're like, trying to reproduce scientific experiments.
Yeah.
It just means that you think like a scientist and you use it to enhance your coaching.
Yeah.
And so as I was, evolving my own thinking and my own sort of philosophy as a coach, my goal was to make this accessible out there for any coach who wants to become to use the tools of science to become a better coach. And my online coaching program is a 5-part system. The first part is really on the science of muscle strength and power, which goes over a lot of the, I'm going to say, a more basic physiology and biomechanics, but I've always found that super interesting. Like I've never as a coach felt like the basic science was a waste of my time. Like I still read textbooks, like old textbooks, just because I feel like there's something when you really understand,
I agree,
where our thought processes come from and originate from, that basic science is a real kind of key step in how we develop new knowledge. So that's the first course. The second course is all around movement assessments and evaluating musculoskeletal function. The third course blends 2 courses together, and it's partly on neuromuscular testing, so using force velocity profiling and isometric strength testing for assessing rate of force development. But it also dovetails into my big area of specialty, which is assessing asymmetries in performance with dual force plate systems. And that's, as I was mentioning before in the monitoring question, it's that we use these double force plate systems to be able to look at inner limb asymmetries, and it's proven to be very, very valuable to me, but also to many others. And it seems like the science is slowly emerging on it as well. It's a great tool. So I've got a full course as part of my coaching program that's dedicated to using dual force plates and how to incorporate that for assessing asymmetries in performance.
Oh, wow.
And then the last 2 courses are on program design and periodization and planning. And so that kind of encapsulates the whole program. And the last part about it is I have a more deep dive into the science, using the tools of science to become a better coach, which includes some basic skills for coaches using a free statistical program called R. It's an open source program. Many coaches use that to do their own data analytics, to do their own analysis, to do their own visualizations and reporting for teams. And so I provide that as a sidebar for anybody who wants to actually take it to another level. And that kind of rounds out the online education program.
That's awesome. And how long is this program, or is it kind of a self-paced?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've struggled on this one just in terms of the fact that I find the individuals who often want to take my courses they're often professionals, like me. They are working inside professional teams, or working inside collegiate programs, or working at other Olympic training centers. And it's just the reality that, they need to do it as self-paced, and they need to be able to come in and take from it what they want, and benefit from, the things that they are looking to seek and to acquire from the sharing process. So it is self-paced, but I also really believe in providing coaches with that one-on-one experience. And so how we run them is the courses are defined periods, but we always offer these online think tank sessions where we come on, we work together, we work through case studies, we work through learnings together. And ultimately, that's how I get to interact with the participants, which is super important to me. I know a lot of online education programs, like, you don't ever speak to the person behind the course. You get the textbook or you get the material, but that's about it. I really strive to make a connection with everybody who takes a course with me, and then try to make new relationships and build new friendships along the way. And so in addition to the material and to the online think tanks, it sort of becomes like a community of people who are wanting to really be at that intersection. We are coach scientists who are, looking to become better coaches and use the pieces of science, not to become researchers, but to use science to become a better coach. And so the group that we've built up is a small group. It's an intimate group that shares that knowledge, has that transparency. And I'm proud to say it's a pretty high level group of individuals that I've had the privilege of interacting with over the years. So it is a more flexible, self-paced type approach, but we really do try to create a personal interaction and a personal experience for the people who take it.
I love that. Okay. And then kind of moving forward a little bit, right? What are some resources that have had a big impact on you, whether it's a book, an article, podcast, seminar, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, one of my Bibles is the two editions of Strength and Power in Sport
Okay.
that were edited by Pavel Comey, who's since passed away.
Mm.
But Strength and Power in Sport for me has kind of been my Bible on going back to the basic things that affect how we generate muscle force,
Yeah.
and those textbooks I think are probably the most basic readings that have been out there for our profession that really will allow a strength coach to develop the basic understanding of the physiology, biology, and biomechanics of how the muscle system works,
Mm.
or the neuromuscular system works.
Yeah.
So I always recommend that. I think that's an amazing textbook. I've also got another textbook or a short read. I love it though. It's called The Art and Science of Scientific Investigation,
Mm.
and that book's I stumbled on it, and I can't remember where I first saw it, but
Yeah.
it was really transformative for
Okay.
me because it goes back through all kinds of different scientific discoveries
Yeah.
and evolution of how different discoveries were made. And to me, it just really stokes my fires for
Yeah.
generating new knowledge and the curiosity of how, we're not, as strength coaches, we're not necessarily out there devising scientific experiments, although that does happen. Instead, we're kind of like Sherlock Holmes, like coaches. We as coaches, it's like Sherlock Holmes arriving to the scene of the accident and looking for clues. And from the clues and observations, we arrive at a hunch for what might have happened.
Mm.
And to me, that coaching process is super organic. It's like you're showing up to the scene of an accident, which is ultimately a training situation. You're gathering the facts and getting new observations, which are leading you to new ideas. And that process was really reinforced by that book. And it's something that I go and reread lots because it gives me lots of inspiration and keeps me motivated to do more for bringing up that sort of science coach interaction.
Okay. And then kind of move into this last segment here, some kind of quicker rapid fire questions, if you will. So if you have any, what are some quotes that you live by?
Well, I mean, I think there's a myriad number of quotes that I could probably share,
Mm-hmm.
but I do live by one that my grandma used to say, and she'd often say it when times were hard, and she would say that this too shall pass.
Mm.
And the quote "this too shall pass" is something that I have almost tattooed inside of my brain because I reflect on my life and I reflect on where I am today.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to kind of almost measure my life in these 4-year cycles because working as an Olympic strength coach, every 4 years we go to the Olympics and then we start fresh and we move to the next adventure.
Yeah.
And it was amazing that every 4 years I would be sitting there and I would be reflecting on where I was the last Olympics, and I would always be like, wow, man, I never would have predicted I would be where I am today.
Yeah.
And that included amazing times like, about to get married and about to get engaged. And it included the next one where I was almost divorced and actually suffering from a super bad back injury and at the lowest point that I had ever been at, to the next one where I was in, a state of not knowing what would be next, but sort of excited about new adventures, until the next Olympics where I was married and had other new exciting things along the way.
Yeah.
And to me, that quote, "this too shall pass," it kind of tells you like it's not only the crap times where when you're in the middle of the dogfight, that it's not going to be there forever.
Yeah.
It also means that you need to appreciate the good times because the good times are also not there forever. And that sort of impermanence is something to me that sums up in that little short and sweet quote.
I like it. Okay. What is the best advice you've ever been given?
I think the best advice I've ever been given was by who would ultimately become my PhD supervisor, who ultimately, he's a brilliant scientist. For the listeners, his name's Walter Herzog, who's extremely well known in the world of biomechanics. He's actually at the forefront of understanding how muscles work at the subcellular level. But Walter was also a track and field coach. And, I remember being in my master's, and Walter, I was proposing some project and some idea, and he's like, hey, science is about figuring out how things work.
Yeah.
And so his advice was try and figure out how things work. And that to me kind of stuck with me. And I'm not going to say that by any stretch I've ever figured out specifically how something works, but it's sort of like left me with this like constant curiosity, which is now always about like, I wonder how that works. I wonder what underpins that. And I guess I'm always kind of challenging my own thinking about that.
Yeah.
And to me, it was a little piece of advice that kind of took me away from sort of superficial, training ideas to trying to get a little bit deeper under the hood about the stuff that we actually care about.
Okay. So in contrast to that, what's the worst advice you've ever been given?
Yeah, the worst advice I was ever given was that doing a master's would be a waste of my time. I actually was given that advice by, again, somebody that your listeners probably would know very well if I mentioned his name, but his advice was, it's a waste of your time. Don't bother doing it. It's not going to add any value.
Yeah.
And I tend to feel that in life that sort of black and white viewpoint is a real dangerous thing. Everyone is on their own journey and on their own path, and you have to be very, very careful about passing your own judgments on to other people, because it's not your journey, it's their journey. And I think at that time that advice was more his journey.
Yeah.
And ultimately it was a reflection of what he thought was important, not necessarily what is important. And so that advice was an interesting one, because if I'd listened to it, I certainly would not have ended up with the amazingly rich experiences I've had over my career, including the opportunity to go back and pursue PhD and do lots of fun and exciting things with many different people around the world.
I love it. Okay. Is there a kind of thought or experience from your past that you've held on to that has made a big difference in your life now?
I think there are, and I think the thought and experience that I've held is that that need to always stay optimistic. And to me, kind of go back to that, like whatever ails you right now, whatever you're up against, whatever that threat is to your person, your family, the biggest thing that's causing you the most stress in life, this too shall pass. And to me, that idea that, God, you don't know where you're going to be in 4 years.
Yeah.
You don't know what it's going to look like. You don't know what the next adventure is, and what your goal is to believe, to believe in yourself, which sounds a bit corny, but it's true.
Yeah.
And to kind of keep swinging, and to keep working, and to never give up on that fight, because it's the fun. That's actually the fun part. And it's going to be the part that you actually remember when you sit there and you look back to be like, man, I was in the darkest place, but look at where I am today. So that idea of being able to stay optimistic, especially in our profession, there's lots of strength coaches out there that you start off and it's rough. Like, it's hard to get a job. It's hard to find a place to land. It's hard to get good mentorship.
Yeah.
And sometimes you feel like you're up against the wall and you don't know where, you don't know why you're doing it. And I just really think that, if you can keep that mentality that whatever is facing you right now and whatever adversity you have, that you're going to get through it, it's going to pass, and you're going to become stronger for having gone through it. And that's going to make you the person that you are 4 years from now. And you can't even conceive of it where you stand right now from your perspective.
Yeah.
If you can remember that, I think it gives everyone it gives me at least a lot of extra energy to meet the challenges of life. And so I use that a lot in my day-to-day to kind of forge on and to keep on swinging.
Okay. Last kind of question here. What projects are you currently working on, and how can people kind of reach out to you and follow your journey?
Yeah, well, current projects are I've got 3 grad students right now that are doing awesome work around return to sport and ACL injuries, and one grad student, Drew Lawson, who's looking at the correlation between hip strength and landing capabilities. I've got another grad student, Nate Morris, is using a really cool ultrasound technique to look at how the hamstring and the semitendinosus muscle changes after ACL reconstruction, where they actually harvest that tendon. He's doing some really interesting work looking at the muscle architecture and how that affects the strength curve of the hamstrings.
Yeah.
And then my other grad student, Brian Yu, is doing some great work around performance fatigability and how it affects biomechanics. So I would say those are 3 things to watch for.
Okay.
I've got 3 articles that I'm currently in the middle of writing right now that should be coming out in the fall, hopefully, if all goes well, that are all around using counter movement jump testing with dual force plate systems and basically the whole space of ACL return to sport.
Yeah.
My online coaching is always evolving, and or online education for strength coaches is always evolving, and I'm definitely adding new components, uplifting courses that we've done in the past. There's new content. It's always evolving and emerging.
Yeah.
And lastly, is I try to keep a pretty healthy rotation out there speaking and presenting. So I'm always trying to share my knowledge. So if people want to stay in touch with me, they can go to my website. It's www.jordanstrength.com.
Okay.
You can learn more about the coach education programs, and you can actually sign up for my mailing list. And I only put that out emails like every couple of months when I'm offering a new course. So you're not going to get bombarded by me with a bunch of different stuff.
Yeah.
It's only when stuff's happening that I send out to my list.
Okay.
You can follow me on Twitter. My handle's at Jordan and Strength, and that's the same handle for my Instagram. So you can get me on both those platforms. And please reach out. I'd love to hear from you, and love to be able to be a part of your journey as a coach, and hopefully help you work on that intersection, the hardest place to be, right at that sweet spot between the coaching and the science. But that's the best place to live. It's where all the magic happens.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Coach, thank you so much for your time. This has been fantastic,
pleasure.
Really eye-opening. I really love what you're doing and your approach to things. So once again, thank you for your time, and hopefully we can connect again soon in the future.
Yeah, it sounds great. I really appreciate you thinking of me, and it was just a great opportunity to have a discussion with you over the past bit.
All right, Coach. I'll talk to you later.
Take care.
Thanks again for joining me. It's hard to believe that it's been a year since I started doing this journey. If you enjoyed the episode, please head on over to iTunes and give me a review and let me know how I can do better, or some guests that you would like to see or hear on the show. And also go ahead and give me a 5-star rating if you would be so kind. Once again, thank you for your time. And until next time, this is the Gamut of Performance Podcast.